The winter afternoon hung heavy with the promise of rain. The sky stretched above the quiet streets, thick with looming gray clouds, as if the heavens themselves hesitated, unsure whether to release the downpour or simply let the cold linger. A sharp breeze whispered through the empty alleyways, rattling loose pieces of paper and sending a hollow chill through the neglected corners of the city. In one such forgotten place, a tiny, shivering figure curled up inside a battered cardboard box barely big enough to shelter its frail body. The puppy, no more than a few weeks old, pressed its damp fur against the edges of the box, seeking warmth that no longer remained. The world around it was nothing but darkness, silent, infinite. It had never seen colors, never known the brightness of daylight or the gentle glow of the moon. Born blind, the little creature had always relied on sound and scent, though even those senses had done little to protect it from the cruel fate it now faced. Abandoned. Left behind for reasons it couldn't understand, the puppy had spent the last hours trembling, its tiny ribs rising and falling in uneven breaths. Hunger gnawed at its belly, but the cold was an even crueler adversary. It had long since stopped whimpering for help. No one had come. No one ever did. But fate had other plans. A few streets away, 10-year-old Emma sat on a wooden bench just outside a small pet store. Her father had stepped inside to pick up a new bag of cat food, leaving her to wait in the crisp winter air. She adjusted her scarf, feeling the soft fabric brush against her cheek, and tilted her head slightly, allowing the world to speak to her in ways most people never listened. To Emma, sound was everything. She could hear the rhythmic hum of passing cars, the occasional chatter of pedestrians, the distant bark of a dog several blocks away. But then, something else. Something different. A sound so soft that most people would have missed it. A faint, almost imperceptible whimper. Emma stilled, her small fingers tightening around the handle of her white cane. She listened closely, filtering out the background noise, isolating the fragile sound. There it was again, a weak, shivering cry carried by the wind from somewhere nearby. Someone was afraid. She turned her head toward the alley beside the store, the source of the sound. Though she couldn't see it, she felt its presence as surely as she could feel the cold air brushing against her skin. Carefully, Emma stood up. She tapped her cane against the pavement, feeling the familiar rhythm of the concrete beneath her shoes. She had walked this path before. She knew where the edges met, where the steps dipped. But beyond that, beyond the safety of the familiar sidewalk, was the unknown. The whimper came again, and something inside Emma tugged her forward. She hesitated only a moment before she took a step. One careful tap of her cane, then another. The alley smelled different, damp, a little musty. It was quieter here, shielded from the noise of the street. The scent of rain hung in the air, mixed with something else, something small, shivering, scared. The puppy. Emma crouched down slowly, her cane resting beside her as she reached forward, searching. The sound of breathing, shallow, uneven, guided her. The puppy felt her presence before she could touch it. Its small body tensed, instinct telling it to shrink back. It had never known kindness, only the rough hands that had placed it here before walking away forever. Emma sensed the hesitation. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice gentle, steady. She stretched out her hand, palm up, giving the little creature a choice, to come closer or remain hidden in the darkness. The puppy sniffed the air, catching something new. A scent unlike the cold asphalt or the wet cardboard. It was warm, familiar in a way it couldn't explain. The scent of a heartbeat, steady and strong. For the first time in hours, perhaps ever, it moved. Just a little. Emma felt the tiniest brush of fur against her fingertips, soft yet damp from the misty air. "There you are." Slowly, she let her hand rest, allowing the puppy to decide. She could feel its hesitation, the way it trembled with uncertainty. "You're scared, aren't you?" she whispered, a knowing smile touching her lips. "I get scared too, but it's better when someone's there with you." A moment passed. Then, hesitantly, cautiously, the puppy inched forward. Emma felt it then, fully, its tiny body curling toward her palm, still shivering but no longer pulling away. She ran her fingers gently through the wet fur, feeling the ridges of its small spine, the delicate rise and fall of its breathing. The puppy let out a sigh, a barely audible exhale, almost as if it had been holding its breath all this time, waiting for something, someone. Emma's heart ached. "You're just like me, aren't you?" she murmured. "We see the world in a different way." The puppy didn't move away this time. It simply lay there, as if it had found something it hadn't known it needed: contact, warmth, the reassurance that it wasn't alone. Behind her, footsteps approached. "Emma?" Her father's voice was gentle but laced with curiosity. She turned slightly, but her hands never left the small, trembling body beside her. "Dad," she said softly. "I found someone." There was a pause, then the quiet shuffle of movement as her father stepped closer. Emma could sense his hesitation before he even spoke. She knew what he was thinking: another responsibility, another challenge. But she also knew what she felt. "We can't leave him," she said firmly, her fingers still resting on the puppy's back. "He doesn't have anyone." Her father exhaled, long and slow. She could tell he was considering, weighing the practicalities. But Emma had already decided. She wasn't leaving without him. The puppy, as if sensing the weight of the moment, shifted closer against her hand, seeking the comfort of her warmth. Her father crouched beside her, letting out a quiet sigh. "You sure about this, sweetheart?" Emma nodded, more sure than anything. Another pause. Then, soft laughter, warm and resigned. "All right," he said finally. "Let's get him home." Emma's lips curled into a smile as she carefully gathered the tiny body into her arms, feeling its warmth against her chest. The puppy's breathing was still uneven, but there was something new beneath the fear, something fragile, but real. Hope. For the first time in both their lives, they weren't alone anymore, and neither of them ever would be again. Emma cradled the tiny, trembling puppy in her arms, her small hands carefully wrapped around its frail body, as if shielding it from the world. She could feel the rhythmic rise and fall of its uneven breaths, the warmth of its damp fur pressing against her coat. The little creature barely moved, exhausted from hunger and cold, yet it nestled into her embrace as if it had already decided. This was home. Her father's voice broke the silence. "Emma?" He sounded both surprised and hesitant as he took a step closer. "What's that?" Emma turned her face slightly toward him, her fingers gently running over the puppy's tiny frame. "I found him," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "He was all alone." Her father crouched beside her, and she could hear the rustle of his jacket as he leaned in to get a closer look. There was a pause, one of those moments where time seemed to stretch, filled with unspoken thoughts. Then, a sigh. "Emma, sweetheart, we can't take in a dog," he said, though his tone held more concern than finality. "You know how much work it takes. We already have Oliver." Emma bit her lip. Oliver, their family cat, had been with them for years, a quiet but independent companion who rarely sought attention. But this was different. "He's blind," she whispered. "Like me." Her father didn't respond right away, and Emma knew what he was thinking. A blind dog? That was more than just a pet. It was a responsibility. "I can take care of him," Emma added quickly. "Please, Dad. He has no one else. Another sigh. She could hear the weight of his thoughts, the calculations of what it would mean to bring this fragile creature into their home. He was a practical man, always considering the bigger picture, but Emma had never asked for anything like this before. Finally, he exhaled. "Your mother's not going to be thrilled," he murmured, rubbing his temple. Emma didn't let go of the puppy. "But you'll let me try?" A pause. Then soft laughter, resigned, affectionate. "Let's get him home before I change my mind." The puppy stirred slightly at the shift in Emma's arms, as if sensing the decision had been made, and so Shadow's journey truly began. The ride home was silent, except for the occasional whimper from the back seat where Emma held the puppy close, wrapped in her scarf to keep it warm. She had named him Shadow the moment they stepped into the car. "Because he follows sound," she had explained when her father asked. "Like a shadow follows light." Her father had merely hummed in response, neither approving nor objecting, but she could tell he was still processing everything. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Emma could feel a shift in the air, the quiet anticipation of change. She stepped carefully out of the car, still clutching Shadow close. The little dog tensed slightly, his small body unfamiliar with the new scents filling the air. Emma ran her fingers gently along his back. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." As they entered the house, the warmth of the indoors wrapped around them like a blanket. The scent of fresh laundry and the faint aroma of coffee from earlier in the day drifted through the air. Then came the sound of approaching footsteps. "Emma?" Her mother's voice echoed from the hallway, followed by the sharp patter of paws. "Oliver." There was a pause before her mother spoke again, slower this time. "What is that?" Emma tightened her grip around Shadow instinctively. "His name is Shadow." Silence. Then, "David," her mother said, directing the name at Emma's father in a tone that was both exasperated and questioning. "What is this?" Emma could feel the tension in the air. She could hear it in the way her mother's breathing changed, the way her father hesitated before answering. "It's a puppy," he finally said. "Yes, I can see that," her mother replied, her voice carrying a mix of concern and disbelief. "Why is there a puppy in our house?" Emma took a deep breath. "Because he needs me," she said, turning toward where she knew her mother was standing. "And I need him." Another pause, then the sound of Oliver, their tabby cat, sniffing curiously at the newcomer. Shadow whimpered softly, shifting in Emma's arms, clearly uncertain about this unfamiliar place. Her mother exhaled. "Emma, having a pet is a lot of responsibility and—" "He's blind," Emma cut in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just like me." That changed everything. For a moment there was only silence. Then her mother's tone softened, almost imperceptibly. He's blind?" Emma nodded. "I found him in an alley. Someone left him there." Her mother didn't respond immediately, but Emma could sense the shift, the hesitance giving way to something else, something unspoken. After a long moment, her mother sighed. "All right, but only if we can take him to the vet first thing tomorrow." Relief flooded Emma's chest. "Thank you." Shadow's head rested against her arm, his small body finally beginning to relax. But the challenges were only just beginning. That first night, Shadow struggled to adjust. Emma had placed a soft blanket in a cozy corner of her room, hoping he would find comfort there. But the moment she tried to leave his side, he whimpered and pawed at the floor, disoriented. He didn't know where he was. Emma knelt beside him, letting her fingers trace along his tiny frame. "You don't know the way, do you?" she murmured. Shadow whined softly. Emma understood that feeling. She lay beside him, her hand resting lightly on his back, listening to the sound of his breathing as it gradually evened out. They weren't so different, after all. The next few days were filled with small victories and frustrating setbacks. Shadow struggled to navigate the unfamiliar space, bumping into furniture, tripping over rugs. Each time he let out a confused little whimper, as if trying to understand what had happened. Emma's parents watched cautiously, clearly wondering if they had made a mistake. But Emma refused to give up. She devised a system, small bells attached to different corners of the house, each with a slightly different sound. She guided Shadow toward them, teaching him to follow their chime. She used her voice, gentle and reassuring whenever he hesitated, giving him a point of reference in the vast, unknown space. Little by little, Shadow learned. He began to recognize the soft jingle near the kitchen, the faint chime by the living room. He followed Emma's steps, trusting her presence. Her parents watched as their daughter grew more patient, more determined. One evening, her father sat beside her as she worked with Shadow, guiding him toward the soft bell near her bed. "You're really committed to this, aren't you?" he asked. Emma smiled as she ran her fingers through Shadow's fur. "He just needs someone to believe in him." Her father was quiet for a moment before he reached out, gently scratching behind Shadow's ears. "I think he already does." By the end of the week, Shadow had learned the layout of the house well enough that he no longer stumbled as often. And in turn, Emma had learned something too. Sometimes the biggest challenges weren't obstacles. They were opportunities. Opportunities to grow, to understand, to connect. Her parents had worried that Shadow would be a burden, that he would make things harder. But the truth was, he had made her stronger. And in return, she had given him something he had never known before: a home. An unbreakable bond. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was Emma's second set of eyes, her guardian in a world neither of them could see. From the moment he stepped into Emma's life, something shifted. Though Shadow was blind, his other senses were heightened beyond what anyone had expected. He learned quickly, attuning himself to every subtle sound, every vibration in the air, every shift in the environment. What he lacked in sight, he made up for with instinct, a deep, unshakable awareness of everything around him. Emma felt it too. The way Shadow moved beside her, his body always close enough that she could sense his presence. The way he responded before she even spoke, anticipating her next step as though their minds were somehow connected. It was as if they were meant to find each other, two souls that had been waiting for the missing piece to make them whole. Shadow never left her side. Whenever she stood up, he was there. Whenever she took a step, he moved with her. It wasn't just companionship, it was something deeper, an understanding, an unspoken agreement between them. In the beginning, Emma still hesitated when stepping outside, unsure of herself in unfamiliar spaces. But with Shadow beside her, everything changed. One afternoon, as her father prepared to take her on their usual walk around the neighborhood, Emma gripped her cane and exhaled. Shadow sat beside her, ears perked, as if sensing her nervous energy. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" her father asked, his voice filled with quiet encouragement. Emma hesitated. For years, walking outside had been a process of careful movements, slow steps, and trust in her father's guiding hand. The world beyond their home had always felt vast, unpredictable. Even with years of training, there had always been that underlying fear, the fear of the unknown. But this time was different. This time, Shadow was with her. Emma took a breath. "I think so," she said, reaching down to feel the warmth of Shadow's fur beneath her fingers. The steady thump of his tail against the floor was like a reassurance. "You're not alone. I'm here." As they stepped onto the sidewalk, the sounds of the outside world enveloped them. The soft murmur of passing cars, the rhythmic clicking of bicycle wheels, the distant laughter of children playing. Emma's senses sharpened as they always did when she walked, but this time she wasn't just relying on herself. She listened to Shadow. He moved when she moved, always keeping just the right pace. When a car approached, even before she could process the distant hum of the engine, Shadow's body tensed beside her. A low whine escaped him, not fear, but alertness. He positioned himself slightly in front of her, signaling that she should stop. Emma felt the change before her father spoke. "Cars passing," he said. "Good job, Shadow." Emma reached down and gave Shadow's ear a gentle scratch. "You're amazing," she whispered, smiling. Step by step, day by day, Shadow learned the world alongside her. But more importantly, Emma learned to trust. Before Shadow, Emma had always been cautious, afraid to go too far beyond what was familiar. The world outside was unpredictable, and while she had learned to navigate it, fear had always lingered at the edges of her mind. But Shadow changed that. He became her anchor, her sense of stability. And with him, Emma began to change, too. She stopped hesitating at the door. She started stepping forward with certainty instead of doubt. The first time she insisted on walking to the park without holding her father's hand, he hesitated. "Are you sure?" he asked, concern laced in his voice. Emma nodded, gripping Shadow's harness. "I have him," she said simply. Her father watched as she took a step forward, her cane tapping lightly against the pavement while Shadow moved beside her, his body pressed just close enough to guide her. It wasn't perfect. There were still small stumbles, still moments where she hesitated. But she didn't stop. Her mother noticed the change too. "Emma's different," she murmured one evening, watching as their daughter moved confidently through the house with Shadow beside her. Her father smiled. "She's stronger." And she was. With Shadow, Emma discovered a confidence she hadn't realized she was capable of. She spoke up more in school, no longer hesitant about asking questions. She started helping her mother cook, something she had always been nervous about before. She even convinced her parents to let her walk Shadow around the block by herself, just once at first, then more and more as they saw how capable she had become. It wasn't that Shadow made her less afraid, it was that he made her brave. At first, Emma's parents had seen Shadow as a responsibility, a challenge even. But now they saw something else. They saw the way Emma laughed more, the way she smiled when Shadow curled up at her feet. They saw the way she carried herself differently, how she held her head higher, how she believed in herself in a way she never had before. They saw how, when she walked through the house, she did so with purpose, Shadow at her side like a silent promise that she would never be alone. One night, as they sat in the living room watching Emma stroke Shadow's fur, her father let out a breath and leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think he needed her just as much as she needed him." Her mother smiled. "I think you're right." Shadow was no longer just a stray they had taken in. He was family, and in the warmth of their home, in the quiet safety of the space they had built together, Emma and Shadow continued to grow, together, step by step, side by side, always. The day had started like any other. A crisp, cool morning, sunlight filtering through the trees, the air filled with the distant sounds of birds and passing cars. Emma had grown to love these walks, the steady rhythm of her cane tapping against the pavement, the comforting presence of Shadow by her side. It was their routine. She had once been afraid of stepping out into the world, afraid of what she couldn't see. But Shadow had changed that. With him, the world didn't feel so vast or uncertain. It felt like something she could navigate, something she could trust, but that trust was about to be shattered. They were halfway through their walk when it happened, a sudden sharp noise, a blaring car horn, too close, too loud. It cut through the morning stillness like a lightning strike. And then, chaos. Shadow tensed beside her, his body going rigid with fear. Before Emma could react, before she could tighten her grip on the leash, he bolted. The leash slipped through her fingers like water. "Shadow!" she gasped, reaching out, but he was already gone. She heard the frantic scrabble of his paws against the pavement, the panicked rustle of movement as he darted away. The leash dragged behind him, bouncing against the ground, completely out of reach. Emma's heart pounded. "Shadow!" she called again, louder this time, desperation creeping into her voice. Nothing. No familiar jingle of his collar, no soft nudge against her leg, no reassuring presence beside her. Just silence, a deep, empty silence that swallowed her whole. Her father was already moving. She could hear his hurried footsteps, the worry in his voice as he called Shadow's name. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing. Shadow was out there, alone. And for the first time since meeting him, Emma felt alone, too. The hours that followed were a blur. They searched the neighborhood, calling Shadow's name until their voices were hoarse. They walked up and down the streets, checking every alley, every yard, every familiar place they had ever been. Nothing. Emma's mother contacted the local shelters, reporting a missing blind dog. They printed out flyers. Emma traced her fingers over the paper, imagining the photo they had chosen. She tried to stay hopeful. But with each passing hour, that hope dimmed. That night, Emma sat curled up on the couch, Shadow's blanket clutched tightly in her hands. She pressed her face against it, inhaling the faint, familiar scent of him. Tears burned behind her eyes. She had never felt this kind of loss before, never felt the sharp, aching void that came from missing something so deeply. Shadow had been there for everything. Every step she took, every moment of doubt, every time she had needed him, he had always been there. Now he wasn't, and it hurt in a way she couldn't describe. Her parents sat beside her, offering soft reassurances, but nothing helped. Nothing except getting him back, and she would. No matter what it took, she would. Days passed. Each morning, Emma woke up hoping today would be the day. Each night, she went to bed wondering if Shadow was out there, scared, alone, waiting for her. She refused to give up. She refused to believe that their story would end like this. Then, on the 7th day, it happened. Emma was walking home with her father after another round of searching when she felt it. Not a sound at first, but a presence. Something at the edge of her senses. Something faint, but familiar. She stopped, holding up a hand. "Wait." Her father paused beside her. "What is it?" She tilted her head, listening, and then a whimper. It was soft, barely there, hidden beneath the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of leaves. But Emma knew. She knew that sound. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the source, toward a narrow alley tucked between two buildings. She stepped forward without hesitation. "Emma, wait!" Her father started, but she was already moving. Her cane tapped against the pavement, each step pulling her closer. Another whimper. Closer. A shaky breath. Closer. And then, her fingers brushed against something soft. Fur. Damp, trembling fur. A small, fragile body curled up against the cold concrete. Emma sank to her knees. "Shadow," she breathed. The puppy let out a weak, barely audible sound, his body barely stirring. But he was there, and he was alive. Emma didn't need to see him to know how much he had been through. His fur was dirty, matted with dust and grime. His body was thinner than before, his breaths shallow, exhausted. But when she touched him, when her fingers traced the familiar curve of his back, Shadow moved. Slowly, with what little strength he had left, he lifted his head. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She reached out, carefully cupping his face in her hands. His nose was dry, his ears twitching weakly at her touch. Then, ever so slowly, he leaned into her. That was all it took. The tears she had been holding back fell. "You found him?" Her father's voice was soft, disbelieving. Emma nodded, unable to speak. Shadow let out a tired, content sigh, his small body relaxing against her. Despite everything, despite the fear, the hunger, the days spent wandering alone, he had waited for her. And she had come. Her father carried Shadow home, careful and gentle, as if cradling something impossibly fragile. When they stepped through the front door, Emma's mother gasped, "Oh, sweetheart!" They wasted no time. A warm bath, soft towels, fresh food, and water. Shadow barely had the energy to eat, but he pressed himself against Emma, as if afraid she might disappear. She never would. That night, he slept curled up beside her, his small body rising and falling with steady, even breaths. Emma stayed awake for a long time, her fingers resting lightly on his fur, her heart still aching from the thought of almost losing him. But he was here. That was all that mattered. And as she finally drifted off to sleep, she whispered the same promise she had made the very first night she held him. "You're safe now." This time, Shadow knew it was true. This time, he would never have to be alone again. Shadow had always been part of Emma's world, but it wasn't until they almost lost him that her parents truly understood how much he meant, not just to Emma, but to their entire family. The night Shadow returned, weak but safe, something shifted in the house. Before, there had been doubts, whispers of worry, soft conversations between Emma's parents about whether adopting a blind puppy had been the right decision. They had feared that Shadow would be too much responsibility, that he would complicate things rather than bring comfort. But all of those doubts vanished the moment they saw Emma's arms wrapped around him, her head resting against his small, fragile body, her face peaceful in a way they hadn't seen in days. That was when they knew. Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was family. Her father sat in his chair that evening watching Emma stroke Shadow's fur as he slept beside her. The little dog still looked exhausted, but there was a quiet relief in his breathing, the kind that came from knowing he was home. Emma's mother, standing nearby, shook her head in quiet amazement. "He came back to her," she murmured. "After everything, he still found his way back." Her father exhaled, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. Or maybe she found her way back to him. And that was it. That was the moment they both understood. Shadow wasn't a burden. He wasn't a challenge to be solved or a responsibility to be managed. He was love. Pure, unwavering, unconditional love. And love was never a burden. It was a light, one that guided people through the darkest times, just as Shadow had guided Emma in ways they hadn't even realized. The change in their home was almost imperceptible at first. Little things, like the way Emma's father instinctively checked Shadow's water bowl before heading to work, or how her mother left a small blanket in the living room just for him, knowing he liked to curl up near the window where the afternoon sun was warmest. There was no longer a question of whether Shadow belonged. He did. And in some ways, Emma changed too. She had always been brave, always resilient. But now there was a new kind of confidence in her voice, a certainty in her steps. She didn't hesitate when walking outside. She didn't second-guess herself when navigating new places. She had learned trust, not just in Shadow, but in herself. And that trust gave her something more: purpose. The invitation arrived unexpectedly. A simple envelope slipped into her school bag, its crisp white edges standing out against her usual books. Emma ran her fingers over the paper, feeling the raised letters printed neatly across the front. Guest speaker invitation. Student assembly. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew what this was. A few weeks ago, her teacher had encouraged her to share her story with the school, about her journey, her challenges, and about Shadow. At first, she had hesitated. She wasn't used to standing in front of crowds, wasn't sure if her voice would carry the way others did. But then she thought of Shadow. She thought about how he had trusted her when he had nothing else. And she knew what she had to do. The auditorium was filled with quiet anticipation. Emma could feel the presence of so many people, students, teachers, even some parents. The subtle rustling of jackets, the shifting of feet against the floor, the nervous energy that hummed beneath the surface, waiting. She stood on the stage, her cane resting at her side, Shadow sitting obediently beside her. A microphone had been placed in front of her, adjusted to the perfect height. She took a breath and began. "My name is Emma," she said, her voice steady despite the quiet tremor in her hands. "And this is Shadow." She reached down, her fingers brushing over his fur, grounding her. "We're both blind," she continued. "And for a long time, I thought that meant I had to go through the world alone." The room was silent. Emma swallowed. "But then I met Shadow, and he showed me that even in darkness, we can find our way, that sometimes what matters most isn't what we see, but what we feel." A pause. Shadow shifted beside her, sensing the weight of the moment. "I was afraid once," Emma admitted. "Afraid of new places, afraid of stepping too far beyond what I knew. But Shadow taught me something important. He taught me that love is light, and that when you have love, you are never truly lost." She heard the first soft sniffles from somewhere in the crowd, the weight of her words settling into the hearts of those listening. She straightened her back. "Shadow and I have learned a lot together," she said. "And if there's one thing I want you to take from our story, it's this. You don't have to see the world to find your place in it. You don't have to walk alone to prove you are strong. And sometimes, the greatest guide you will ever find is love." Silence. Then, applause. It started softly, hesitantly, then grew. A wave of sound, of appreciation, of understanding. Emma felt the warmth of it, the energy of people who weren't just clapping because they were supposed to, but because they felt it, because they understood. She smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. And for the first time in a long time, she knew. They had found their light, together. That night, when Emma returned home, her parents were waiting for her. Her mother pulled her into a warm hug, whispering, "We're so proud of you." Her father ruffled her hair playfully, his voice gruff with emotion. "You knocked it out of the park, kid." Emma laughed, leaning down to hug Shadow, who wagged his tail happily. And in that moment, she realized something. She had started this journey believing she was rescuing him. But the truth was, he had rescued her too. He had given her courage. He had taught her trust. He had shown her that love is never a weight. It is what carries us forward. And as Shadow curled up beside her that night, his soft breaths filling the space around them, she whispered her final promise. "We'll keep finding the light, together." And she knew. He understood. Time had a way of moving forward, effortlessly slipping through days, months, and seasons. What once felt new and uncertain soon became familiar, woven into the fabric of everyday life. Emma and Shadow grew together, their bond deepening with every step they took. There were moments of laughter, moments of quiet understanding, and moments that reminded them of how far they had come. Shadow had once been a scared, abandoned puppy, lost in a world he couldn't see. Emma had once been a girl afraid to step beyond what she knew. Now, they were inseparable. They had become two souls moving as one, not bound by sight, but by something far more powerful. The seasons changed around them, marking time in ways Emma couldn't see but could feel. She felt it in the crispness of the autumn air, the way the leaves crunched under Shadow's paws as they walked their usual path. She felt it in the softness of winter, in the way Shadow curled beside her near the fireplace, their breaths synchronized as they drifted to sleep. She felt it in the warmth of spring when flowers bloomed and the world seemed to hum with life. Shadow would pause to sniff the air, his ears twitching as he took in the scents of fresh rain and earth. And then came summer, the season of golden light and long walks at dusk. It was in those summer evenings that Emma felt most at peace. The world seemed to slow, wrapped in the gentle glow of the setting sun. Even though she had never seen a sunset, she could feel it in the warmth on her skin, in the way the air carried a softness that only came at the end of the day. And always, Shadow was beside her. One evening, as the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Emma stood at the edge of their porch, listening to the world settle into twilight. "Come on, Shadow," she said, reaching down to touch his fur. "Let's go for a walk." The little dog wagged his tail, pressing himself close to her side as they stepped forward together. Emma didn't need her cane for this walk, not when she had Shadow. Their steps fell into an easy rhythm, their pace perfectly matched. Shadow had learned every turn, every corner of their familiar path. He moved instinctively, his body always positioned just close enough to guide Emma, but never so close that it made her feel dependent. They weren't just a girl and her dog. They were partners. The world around them buzzed with the soft sounds of the evening, distant voices, the rustle of trees, the occasional bark of another dog somewhere down the street. Emma tilted her head, letting the sounds wash over her. She reached down, running her fingers along Shadow's back. His fur was soft beneath her touch, his body steady, constant. "Do you think we were meant to find each other?" she mused aloud, her voice quiet, thoughtful. Shadow didn't answer, of course, but he didn't need to. He simply was, beside her, with her, always. Emma had once thought that seeing was the most important thing in the world, that without sight, she was missing something. But Shadow had taught her otherwise. She had learned to experience life in ways beyond what eyes could provide. She had learned to listen, not just to sound, but to the meaning behind it. She had learned to feel, not just with her hands, but with her heart. And she had learned that some things didn't need to be seen to be real, like love, like trust, like the warmth of a sunset, even if you couldn't see the colors. She stopped walking for a moment, letting the evening breeze brush against her skin. Shadow did the same, pausing as if he too was taking in the quiet beauty of the moment. Emma smiled. It didn't matter that she couldn't see the sky. She could feel its beauty, and that was enough. As they made their way back home, Emma thought about how much had changed, how much she had changed. She had started this journey thinking she was saving Shadow, but the truth was, he had saved her too. He had taught her courage. He had shown her that she was never truly alone. And most of all, he had proven that love was the greatest guide of all. As they reached the front steps, Shadow nudged her gently, his way of saying, "We're home." Emma laughed softly, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "Yeah," she murmured, "we are." She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this. She and Shadow would face it together. Because when you have love, you are never truly lost. And that was the greatest light of all. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in its final glow of warmth. A girl and her dog walked side by side, their silhouettes blending into the golden light. Two souls, perfectly in sync. No need for sight, just a heart that understood. And that was enough. This heartwarming story is more than just a tale about a girl and her dog. It's a testament to the power of love, trust, and resilience. It reminds us that true connection goes beyond what we can see. It is something felt, something understood deep within. Dog stories often capture the unwavering loyalty of our four-legged companions, But this one goes a step further, showing how two souls, both navigating a world without sight, find light in each other. Through patience and understanding, Emma and Shadow prove that love is not a burden, but a guiding force. Their journey teaches us that challenges do not define us. How we face them does. And sometimes the greatest lessons in courage and hope come from the most unexpected places. In a world that often values what is seen, this story serves as a gentle reminder. The most important things in life, love, loyalty, and the bonds we share, are felt with the heart. Because in the end, it's not about what we see, but about who walks beside us. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.